The day Richard Harmon died, every single person in that hospital room was already thinking about the money. Not one of them was thinking about him. Richard Harmon was 74 years old, founder of Harmon Industries, self-made billionaire, one of the wealthiest men in American history, with a fortune estimated at $6.7 billion. He had built an empire from nothing, starting with a single hardware store in rural Georgia that he turned into the largest industrial supply chain in the country over 50 years of relentless, unforgiving work. He had 3 children, a son named Carter, 48, who ran the company's East Coast operations and had been quietly positioning himself as heir apparent for years. A daughter named Diane, 45, who'd married a senator and spent most of her time in Washington cultivating connections she planned to leverage the moment her father's money became her money. And a younger son named Preston, 41, who'd never worked a day in his life, burned through 2 marriages and a small personal fortune Richard had given him at 30, and showed up to family events just often enough to stay in the will. They were all there that Tuesday morning in the private suite at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. Carter standing by the window, already on his phone, Diane dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief, performing grief she didn't quite feel, Preston slumped in a corner chair, hungover from the night before, checking the time. And in the bed, connected to monitors that beeped steadily, growing slower with each passing hour, was Richard Harmon. Here's what his children didn't know, what nobody in that room knew. Richard Harmon had spent the last 3 years of his life doing something extraordinary, something completely secret, something that would be revealed only after he was gone. The monitors slowed. The nurse stepped back. A doctor entered quietly, checked the readings, and looked at the family with that expression doctors develop after years of delivering the inevitable. Carter put his phone away. Diane's dabbing became slightly more vigorous. Preston sat up straight. Richard Harmon opened his eyes one final time, and here's what the nurses would later tell people, what became whispered legend among the hospital staff for years afterward. He looked at his children, one by one, Carter, Diane, Preston, and his expression wasn't peaceful. It wasn't sad. It wasn't the look of a man surrendering to death. It was satisfied, almost amused, like a man who had just played the greatest hand of his life and was waiting for everyone else to see the cards. Richard Harmon smiled, a full, genuine, deeply contented smile, and then he closed his eyes for the last time. The monitors flatlined at 9:23 a.m. on a Tuesday. Carter immediately called the company's lawyers. Diane called her publicist. Preston asked a nurse if the hospital had a bar. None of them understood the smile. They assumed it was the morphine, or the peace of death, or some final surrender to the inevitable that they'd never have to worry about themselves because they were going to live forever on their father's money. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Friday, a week of what passed for mourning in the Harmon household, a public funeral attended by politicians and CEOs and half of Georgia's old money elite, followed by private arguments between Carter and Diane about who would take which office at Harmon Industries headquarters. Friday arrived. The family gathered in the conference room of Harmon Industries' Atlanta headquarters, the same building Richard had built from the ground up, whose lobby still displayed the original cash register from his first hardware store in a glass case. The family's lawyer, a silver-haired Atlanta institution named Gerald Fitch, sat at the head of the table. He had represented Richard Harmon for 30 years. He knew everything. And as the family settled into their seats, Carter in the power position directly across from Gerald, Diane beside him, Preston late as always, Gerald's expression was carefully, professionally neutral. But his hands, Carter noticed, were very still, the way hands get when someone is concentrating very hard on not revealing something. Carter leaned forward. "Let's get on with it, Gerald." Gerald opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. Not a standard will document, an envelope, cream-colored, Richard Harmon's personal stationery, sealed with wax, actual wax, old-fashioned, with the Harmon Industries seal pressed into it. "Before I read the will," Gerald said, "my father asked me to read this letter first. His instructions were very specific. The letter must be read before anything else, in full, without interruption." Diane frowned. "What letter? This isn't standard." "It was your father's wish," Gerald said firmly, "and I intend to honor it." He broke the wax seal. Unfolded 3 pages of cream stationery covered in Richard Harmon's distinctive handwriting, sharp and precise, the handwriting of a man who'd signed 10,000 contracts. Gerald cleared his throat and began to read. "To my children, if you're hearing this, I'm gone. And I imagine you're sitting in that conference room trying to look sad while actually calculating your inheritance. Don't be embarrassed. I know you. I raised you. Or rather, I failed to raise you, which is something I want to explain. Carter's jaw tightened. Diane set down her pen. Even Preston sat up straighter. Gerald continued reading. I spent 50 years building Harmon Industries, 50 years of 6 a.m. mornings and midnight phone calls and missed birthdays and holidays cut short because the company needed me. I told myself it was for you, for your future, for the family legacy. I told myself that giving you everything, the best schools, the trust funds, the connections, the safety net, was how a father showed love. Gerald paused, then kept reading. I was wrong. What I actually gave you was the ability to never need anything. And people who never need anything never become anything. I watched you grow up into exactly what I accidentally designed. People who are very good at spending money and very bad at everything else. And I'm sorry for that, truly. That failure is mine. The room was absolutely silent. So here is what I've decided to do. 3 years ago, I rewrote my will. Gerald has the details, and he'll share them after this letter. But I want you to hear it from me first, in my own words, so you understand not just what I decided, but why. Gerald turned to the second page. His voice was steady. Harmon Industries will not be inherited by any of you. I have sold a controlling stake to an employee trust, meaning the people who actually built this company alongside me, the workers and managers and drivers and warehouse staff who gave their lives to this business, will now own it and benefit from its success. They earned it. You didn't. Carter made a sound like he'd been punched. Diane's silk handkerchief dropped to the table. Preston's mouth fell open. Gerald kept reading, his voice never wavering. My personal fortune of $6.7 billion has been divided as follows. $1 billion has been placed in a trust for the Harmon Foundation for Rural Education to build schools, fund scholarships, and create opportunities in communities like the one I grew up in, where a poor kid with a hardware store somehow managed to change his life. I grew up with nothing. Too many children still do. That needs to change. He can't, Gerald started. Please, Gerald said firmly. I must finish the letter. He turned to the third and final page. $2 billion has been left to a woman named Clara Webb. Clara is 71 years old. She lives in a small house in Macon, Georgia. Most of you have never heard her name, but 53 years ago, Clara Webb was the woman I loved more than anything in this world. We were 21 years old, poor as church mice, completely in love. I wanted to marry her. My father, your grandfather, forbade it. Clara's family was the wrong kind, he said. Wrong background, wrong connections. She would hold me back, he said. The room was so quiet you could hear the building's air conditioning. I was a coward, Gerald read, Richard's words filling the room like a ghost speaking. I chose my father's approval and his business connections over the woman I loved. I told Clara it was over. I watched her cry and I walked away. I told myself I'd find someone else, someone more suitable. And I did. I married your mother, who was perfectly suitable and perfectly miserable, and died at 62 from a sadness I think I put inside her. And I never stopped thinking about Clara. Diane was crying now, real tears this time. The whether from grief or the evaporating billions, it was impossible to tell. 3 years ago, when the doctors told me about my heart, I hired someone to find Clara. She never remarried, never had children, spent her life as a school teacher in Macon, teaching 3rd grade for 40 years. Never made much money, never complained from what I understand. Just lived a quiet, decent, good life, the kind of life I should have built with her 53 years ago. Gerald's voice softened slightly as he read the next lines. I visited her, didn't tell her who I was at first, just an old man from her past coming to apologize. We talked for 6 hours that first day, then we kept talking. Every week for the past 3 years I have driven to Macon and spent the day with Clara Webb. She's the same woman I fell in love with at 21, kind, sharp, funny, and completely unimpressed by my money. She never asked for anything, which is exactly why she deserves everything. Carter was on his feet now. This is insane.
This is absolutely... Sit down, Carter, Gerald said, in a tone that had probably silenced courtrooms. Carter sat. To my 3 children, Gerald continued reading, I am leaving $100 million each. Before you react, I know that sounds like a lot. And it is a lot. More than most people will see in 1,000 lifetimes. You will be fine. You will be more than fine. But you will not be handed an empire you did nothing to build. Because I love you enough to finally stop enabling you. Gerald set down the letter and looked at the 3 Harmon children over his reading glasses. There is one final paragraph, he said quietly. Your father wrote it separately from the rest. He picked up a smaller piece of stationery, Richard Harmon's handwriting covering just a few lines. I am dying with a smile on my face. leaving, but because 3 years ago, I found my courage again. Too late for many things, but not too late for what mattered most. I told Clara I loved her. I apologized for my cowardice. I spent 3 years actually living instead of just accumulating. And last Tuesday, sitting in her garden in Macon while she pretended not to notice me falling asleep in the sunshine, I felt something I hadn't felt in 50 years. Peace. Real, genuine, unearned peace. That smile your nurse probably told you about, that was for Clara. It was always for Clara. Gerald folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. The room was silent for a long, long moment. Carter stared at the table. Diane was openly crying, and this time somehow it seemed real. Preston, hungover, chronically irresponsible, perpetually disappointing Preston, had his face turned toward the window, and his shoulders were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with laughter. Because here's the thing about Richard Harmon's letter. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about Clara. It was about a man who'd spent 50 years doing everything right by every measure that society uses to keep score. The wealth, the empire, the legacy, and dying with the knowledge that he'd gotten almost everything wrong that actually mattered. And then spending his last 3 years trying to make it right. In Macon, Georgia, a 71-year-old retired school teacher named Clara Webb received a phone call that Friday morning. Gerald Fitch, reading from his notes, told her about the will, about the $2 billion, about the letter Richard had written. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Clara Webb said something that Gerald Fitch would repeat for the rest of his life whenever anyone asked him about the strangest case he'd ever handled. She said, "I don't need his money. I needed him. But I'm glad he found his peace. I'm glad he died smiling." Then she said she'd donate most of it to rural schools in Georgia, just like Richard's foundation, because that, she said, is what Richard would have actually wanted. And that is why the billionaire died with a smile. Not because of the billions, not because of the empire, not because of the legacy his children were fighting over before his body was even cold, but because in the final chapter of his life, Richard Harmon had finally learned the only lesson that actually mattered, that it is never too late to choose love over legacy, never too late to apologize for your cowardice, never too late to spend an afternoon falling asleep in someone's garden and feel completely, perfectly at peace. The smile wasn't about death. It was about finally, after 74 years, knowing how to live. In memory of every person who chose the wrong thing and spent a lifetime wondering what the right thing felt like,